I often get questions in the comments of my videos about how I think about the notes and why I stick with note names so often and not just use the intervals against the chord. So in this video, I want to talk about how I think you need to see or understand notes when you're improvising and the two intervals that you want to assign to each note that you play, because that's very useful and very important for improvisation. My name is Larsen, learn jazz, make music. Often when you're just starting out with improvising and you're playing guitar, then you'll learn a scale shape, and it's really just going to be a visual shape that you can play on the neck. You don't really know what notes are in there, and when you're soloing, you're just sort of trying things out and then correcting it by ear using a lot of trial and error. It's also likely that you maybe even remember that when you were improvising, you figured out that one specific note sounded really great on a chord. That could be the 9th on a minor chord, or maybe the sharp 11 on a major 7 chord. And in the beginning, that really just was one note, one place in the scale, and you kind of just tied it to that scale shape or that chord shape and couldn't really do a lot with it. I think the good thing about this is that it's probably really tied to how that note sounds in the context. So it's really based on sound and music. It's not about theory knowledge, but once you start getting into jazz, you kind of want to be able to find all the chord tones in a scale when you're improvising over that chord. And you also want to be aware of what the other notes in the scale are against that chord. As far as I know, a lot of people think about the notes only as the interval against the chord that they're playing. This makes a lot of sense because it's a great way to connect the note to a sound on the chord. If you're playing a flat 7, then you know what a flat 7 sounds like against a dominant chord, or a major 9th against a dominant chord. So in that way, it's really a way of connecting to how the notes that you play in your solo actually sound. That's something that's extremely useful. And on the guitar, you can actually take this even further because you can visualize the intervals from the root note as a way of organizing the fretboard and having an overview of where the notes are, but also connecting this to how they sound. I believe Tom Quayle uses this as a huge part of how he views the fretboard. But that's of course not the only thing that makes him an amazing guitar player. There are of course some drawbacks to thinking like this, because you're zooming in really a lot and you're only looking at that one single chord. And in doing that, then you're actually losing a lot of information, because an F7 is one type of chord in G major, it's another type of chord in B flat major, and a third type of chord in E major. If you learn the intervals against the chord, then you have a way of finding the notes that you want to play, and you also have an idea about how they actually sound at that point in the song. That's all great, so what is the problem? Let's say that you're improvising over a chord progression like this one. An important part of playing a solo on a chord progression like this is that you're able to play melodies that just smoothly or naturally transition from one chord to the next. And that's a little bit difficult if you're only thinking about the notes in terms of the chord that you're on, because then you would have to think about where you're going. So you kind of need to know what the notes on the C major 7 are against the B flat 7. And that gets a little bit weird because they don't actually make a lot of sense. Converting the B flat 7 notes to C major 7 would also be a lot of thinking and sort of an artificial way of understanding what is going on. And if we zoom out a little bit more and then just look at the entire chord progression that this small progression would be a part of, that could be something like this. So this is a fairly basic progression in the key of C major, going to the 4th degree and then a 4 minor chord, in this case the backdoor dominant, and then back to the tonic. And what is really important for this progression is that we have this guideline going through it. So we need a way of understanding how the chords move and what is really important for the sound of the entire progression, not only what the notes are against the chord. And that's simply just because if you look at these notes against the chord, then you're not really going to see that there is a connection and that they move like this, because you get 7, flat 7, 3rd, flat 7, 5th. So you don't really have the impression that this is in fact a very strong part of the sound of that chord progression, even though you can hear that it is. That's why you want to know two intervals for each note that you play. You want to be aware of what the note is against the chord, which is going to tell you a lot about how it sounds. And you also want to be aware of what the note is in the key or in the context if you're not playing a tonal piece of music, because both of those things are really going to help you when you're improvising over a chord progression and you want to make strong lines and also connect to that chord progression. But keep in mind that this is not the kind of thing that you want to calculate while you're trying to improvise over a B flat 7. You don't need a two-dimensional representation of all the notes in your solo. You just need to play a solo that makes sense. And all these things are something that you don't need to consciously think about, you need to be aware of them. So you work on them when you're practicing, when you're trying to figure out what notes to use and what sounds good on a B flat 7, not while you're trying to play a piece of music. And I think this is really an important but also a very difficult part of this, because at the same way as you always know how to find A minor pentatonic in the 5th fret, you also just always want to be aware of the fact that the flat 7 of B flat 7 is an A flat. I already talked about some of the problems you run into if you're only relating the notes to the chord that you're improvising over. But of course, you're also going to run into trouble if you're only thinking from the key, if you're not really able to think about the chords that you're playing. So let's say that you're improvising in the key of C major and you have to improvise over an F major 7 chord. Then if you're only thinking of the intervals against the root, it's really difficult to figure out what you need to play over that F major 7 to really nail the changes, to really connect with the chord progression. That's also not a practical way to approach it. This is one of the two important reasons that I think more in note names than in a specific interval, because I find that that's a good way to sort of lock the two together, connect the information so that I know what that note sounds like on the chord, but also what note it is in the context of the piece of music that I'm playing, which mostly means what it is in the key. And this is simply because I think it's easier to think of A flat as being the flat 7 of B flat 7, but also at the same time realize that A flat wants to resolve down to G, the 5th of C major 7, when the chord goes from B flat 7 to C major 7. But actually I think there's also another really different reason that I use note names so much. When I learned jazz and when I studied jazz, I wasn't actually around a lot of other guitar players except for my teachers, because most of the time I was around the people that I was playing with. So that would be drummers, bass players, piano players, vocalists and horn players, and they don't really think in shapes on the fretboard or intervals in that way. So the common language there is really much more just note names, chords, harmony, and the basic way of thinking about this. And I think that of course was a huge part of why I'm thinking like this. This is the kind of thing that you're not aware of while you're in the middle of it. But in hindsight, I think actually a lot of how I think about music was shaped in how I was talking to other people about it, of course. And I think I learned maybe as much, maybe even more, hanging around in the breaks, smoking cigarettes and drinking coffees with the students and the teachers as I did in the lessons themselves. And in that way, jazz is a funny thing to study. If you want to learn how to play jazz, then you need to have a strong overview of the fretboard, because when you're improvising over chord progressions, you need to be able to find the right scales and the arpeggios and have the overview to really nail the changes, but also make some solid lines. If you want to work on this aspect of your playing, then check out this playlist, because in there the videos are covering how to improve your fretboard overview, coming from scales, but also using different exercises that will really improve this aspect of your playing. When you improvise, do you mostly stay in one area of the neck, or do you move around a lot?